There are moments in a woman's life that arrive quietly. Not with thunder, not with a slammed door, not with raised voices, but with a smile. A particular kind of smile. The kind that knows something you don't. The kind that has already decided what you are worth before you've opened your mouth. I know that smile well. I have been wearing it for years. My name is Margaret Chen. I am 63 years old. I have outlasted 3 business downturns, 1 flood that nearly took everything I had built, and the particular cruelty of watching people you raise decide that you are furniture. Not a person. Furniture. Something to be moved around, ignored, occasionally dusted off when guests arrive. I have been patient. I have been quiet. I have learned, over the course of a very long life, that the woman who says nothing often knows the most. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where every story of this kind begins. Not with the reckoning, but with the ordinary morning that came before it. Because that is how these things always go. The wound doesn't announce itself. It just shows up one Tuesday, wearing your son's wife's perfume, standing in the middle of a department store you happen to own. ___________. If this story is already finding its way under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to Linda's Life Diaries. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the ones who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's see if that's true. I want you to understand what my life looked like from the outside. From the outside, I was Margaret Chen, who lived in the house on Whitfield Lane that needed its gutters cleaned. I drove a 2009 Toyota Camry that had a small dent above the rear left wheel well. I cooked congee on Sunday mornings and kept a vegetable garden in the back that my daughter-in-law Vivian once described as charming, in a very rustic sort of way. I wore clothes that were clean and pressed and never quite fashionable enough. Sensible shoes, quiet colors, the kind of cardigan that a woman wears when she has stopped caring what the world thinks of her silhouette. I had a son named Daniel. He was 34, handsome in a way that reminded me of his father, and deeply in love with a woman who had decided, within 6 months of marrying him, that she understood our family better than any of us did. Vivian. I need to be careful here, because I am not interested in making her a villain. Life is rarely that clean. Vivian was not a cruel woman in the way that some women are cruel. Not cutting, not sharp, not particularly aware of the harm she caused. She was something slightly different. She was a woman who had grown up being told she was exceptional, and she had believed it so thoroughly for so long that she no longer checked whether it was true. She was 31. She worked in marketing for a cosmetics company downtown. She had excellent taste, genuinely excellent taste, and she expressed it constantly the way some people use breathing. Everything she owned was chosen carefully. Everything in her environment was a statement about who she was. And I, with my Camry and my cardigans and my gutters that needed cleaning, was a statement she would have preferred not to make. She was not unkind to me at first. She was, and I want to find the exact word, managed. I was managed the way a complicated situation is managed. I was handled with the particular politeness that is indistinguishable from dismissal if you're not paying close attention. But I was always paying close attention. Daniel, my son, loved both of us in the way that good men love the women in their lives, completely and without much subtlety about the tensions between them. He believed, as good men tend to believe, that everything was essentially fine, that his mother was happy, that his wife was kind, that the silence at Sunday dinners was just the natural quiet of a family settling into itself. He did not notice when Vivian began finishing my sentences. He did not notice when she started redirecting dinner conversation away from my childhood, my career, my opinions. He did not notice, or if he did, he did not name it, when she began to speak about me in the third person while I was still in the room. Margaret doesn't really follow current events, she said once, to a friend of hers who had come for dinner. She's more of a, home person. I was sitting 3 feet away. I said nothing. I smiled the way I had been smiling for 63 years, and I passed the salt and I watched her, and I thought, I am deciding what to do with you. I have not decided yet, but I am deciding. There is a particular dynamic that forms in families when the son has married, and the mother has been quietly repositioned, and everyone has agreed, without saying so explicitly, that this is simply how things are now. Daniel called me every Sunday. He visited on alternating weekends. He was thoughtful about birthdays and remembered, without prompting, that I preferred lychee cake to chocolate. He was a good son. A genuinely good son. But there were things Daniel did not know. He did not know, for instance, why I had been so calm when his father died 15 years ago. Not cold, I was not cold, I wept for a long time, but calm. Organized. Purposeful. David Chun had been a man of great warmth and very little practical caution, and in the years before his death, I had quietly been the one who had organized, structured, and protected everything we had built together, so that when he was gone, there was something real left to hold. He did not know that the small medical supply business David had started in 1989, the one that imported precision equipment from manufacturers in Germany and Japan, had grown under my hand into something considerably more substantial. He knew I worked there. He knew I helped run things. He did not know the degree to which I had run things. He did not know because I had never told him, because it had never come up, because Vivian had a way of steering dinner conversations toward interior design and travel plans and away from business, that ChunMed Supply now operated warehouses in 4 cities and held distribution contracts with 11 hospital networks across the country. He did not know that the building downtown where Vivian's cosmetics company leased their 3rd-floor offices was a building whose ownership, through a series of holding structures that would require a patient lawyer to explain, ultimately traced back to me. He did not know any of this because I had never announced it. David used to say, "Show your hand only when you have already won." I had always believed him. I had lived by it for 30 years. I had also, and this is the part that becomes relevant, recently, quietly, in a move that had required approximately 2 years of careful planning and a considerable amount of patience, purchased the Harrington department store on Meridian Street. Harrington was an old building. It had been struggling for a decade, caught between the glossy new developments on the north end of downtown and the practical discount shops that had eaten its middle-market customer base. I had bought it not as an investment in its current form but because I knew, having spent years watching the city's development corridors shift, exactly what that block of Meridian Street was going to be worth when the transit expansion came through in 18 months. I had also bought it because I liked it. Because it had been there when I was a young woman new to this city, saving my money in a coffee tin under the kitchen sink, and there was something satisfying about owning the place where I had once stood with my face pressed to the window. The new management team I had installed knew me as Ms. Chun, the principal owner. They were professional, discreet, and very good at their jobs. I visited occasionally, always quietly, always dressed the way I always dressed, my cardigans, my sensible shoes, and they greeted me accordingly. The general public did not know who owned Harrington's. Vivian certainly did not know. And on the morning that changed everything, she did not know, and I did not tell her, and the manager of the women's clothing floor, a man named Paul Whitmore who had worked in retail for 22 years and could identify a principal owner at 30 paces, saw us come in together and had to make a very fast decision about what to do. But I am getting ahead of myself again. Let me tell you about Vivian and Daniel's apartment. It was on the 14th floor of a building in the River District, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen island and the kind of spare, curated aesthetic that takes considerable effort to maintain. Vivian had decorated it herself. This was a point of pride, and she had done it beautifully, in the way that someone decorates a space when they want you to understand something specific about them. Every object was intentional. Every surface was a considered choice. I visited once a month, sometimes less. When I visited, I sat in the sitting area where Vivian had placed the accent chairs, very stylish, not very comfortable, and I drank the tea that Daniel made, and I listened to Vivian talk about her work, her projects, her opinions about various things, and I said appropriate things at appropriate moments, and I watched. I watched the way she spoke to Daniel when she thought I was looking at the view. Efficient. Directional. He was a good man and he loved her, and she was, when she remembered to be, when she was not distracted by something more important, genuinely fond of him. But there was a quality to their dynamic that I recognized, the way you recognize a weather pattern that has been building since morning. Vivian managed Daniel the way she managed me. The way she managed everything. From the front confidently with the assumption that this was simply how things were supposed to work. She was not wrong exactly. She was just missing a piece of information. Several pieces, actually. There were 5 things I had noticed about Vivian in the 2 years since she had entered our family. I noted them the way I noted everything, quietly, without comment, in the particular mental ledger I keep for things that will matter later. The first. She had never once asked me a question about my work. Not one. In 2 years, at every dinner, every Sunday call, every birthday gathering, she had never said, "So, Margaret, what's happening with the business?" Not because she was incurious in general, she was curious, quite curious, she asked questions constantly about topics that interested her, but because my business simply did not exist in her version of the world. I was a retired woman who helped out at her late husband's old supply company. That was all she had decided I was, and so that was all she saw. The second, she had begun, in small and deniable ways, to express opinions about how Daniel should handle the family money. This was a phrase that covered, apparently, whatever Daniel might eventually inherit from me. She had floated twice the suggestion that it might be more organized if Daniel had some kind of formal understanding of my financial situation. She had said this in the particular tone people use when they mean something quite specific but want to seem like they're raising a general concern. The third. She had started to include her own mother in Sunday dinners. This was not objectionable in itself. Her mother, Helen, was a pleasant enough woman, sharp and observant, who had clearly passed on the skill of managing a room. What I noticed was the geometry of these dinners. When Helen was present, I was seated at the corner of the table. When Helen was absent, I sat where I had always sat, at the side near the window. Small thing. I said nothing. The fourth, she had twice told a story in my presence about a woman she knew, a friend's mother-in-law, always carefully unnamed, who had held the family back by being too involved, too present, too much in the way of her son's marriage. The moral of the story shifted depending on who was listening, but the core was consistent. Mothers-in-law who stayed in their lane made for happier families. I noted this. I said nothing. The fifth thing, and this is the one that crystallized everything for me, that moved my thinking from patient observation to active preparation, was something small enough that I might have missed it, if I had not been the kind of woman who notices small things. One Sunday, Daniel and I were washing dishes together after dinner, the way we had done since he was a small boy, while Vivian and Helen sat in the living area. I heard Vivian say, not quietly, not loudly, just at the conversational volume of a woman who had forgotten to remember that sound carries in a small apartment, the following: "She's fine, Mom. She's just very, set in her ways. She's not really going to be a problem. Not going to be a problem." I kept washing. I did not look up. My hands were steady. The water was warm. Daniel said something I didn't catch. Helen murmured something reassuring. I finished the dishes. I folded the towel the way I have always folded it, with the edges aligned. I went back to the living area and I sat in my accent chair and I had another cup of tea, and Vivian smiled at me with the particular warmth she kept for occasions when she needed me to feel welcome, and I smiled back. Inside, something had moved into a different position. Not anger, not quite anger, not yet. Clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a pattern you have been watching finally becomes a shape you can name. I was being observed, assessed, and pre-managed. She had decided I was not going to be a problem. I thought, we'll see about that. There are things I do that no one knows I do. Every Wednesday, I leave the house at 7:30 in the morning, and I drive to the offices of ChunMed Supply on the east side of town. I park in the lot. I take the elevator to the 3rd floor. I spend 4 to 5 hours working on contracts, on logistics, on the particular kind of careful financial thinking that has been the engine of everything I have built for 30 years. My team there knows me as what I am. The owner, the woman who built the company, the woman who knows where every number comes from and what it means. They are professional and competent, and they address me with the particular deference you extend to someone who has earned it through 30 years of very careful work. At noon, I usually eat alone in my office. I have the same lunch most days, congee from the place 2 blocks away, or occasionally something from the deli on Faro Street. I read. I think. I prepare for the afternoon. At some point during the year before Vivian and Daniel's wedding, I had begun, carefully, privately, without telling anyone, to restructure certain aspects of my estate. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone would notice without looking very carefully. But the restructuring was purposeful. I had seen the way the world was moving, the way my family was taking shape, and I had wanted to make sure that the things I had built were protected in the ways they needed to be protected. Part of that restructuring was the purchase of Harrington's. Part of it was a set of adjustments to the holding structures that governed how ChunMed's assets were organized. Part of it was a conversation I had about 14 months before the morning in Harrington's with my lawyer, a man named George Fenn, whom I had known since he was a junior associate and I was 42 and still learning what I was capable of, in which I explained what I wanted and he listened and said, "When I was done, Margaret, you're very good at this." I said, "I've had a lot of practice." There was one person who knew pieces of this. Not all of it, I was careful with all of it, but pieces. Her name was Clara. She was my sister's daughter, my niece, 27 years old, with a degree in accounting and the kind of quiet, watchful intelligence that runs in families. She worked for me, officially as a financial analyst, unofficially as the person I trusted most in any room. Clara had been present at Sunday dinners exactly once. Vivian had been perfectly pleasant to her. Clara had watched the whole evening with the expression of someone taking notes without a pen, and on the drive home afterward, she had said very carefully, "Aunt Margaret, I think I understand why you've been restructuring." I had said, "Don't make assumptions." She had said, "Okay. But I'm available whenever you need me." That was enough. There were other small things I did in this period that no one saw. I visited Harrington's twice in those months, walking through the store on the Wednesday mornings when I had finished early at the office. Paul Whitmore, who managed the women's clothing floor, had by now learned my preference for entering through the side staff entrance and making my way through the store without drawing attention. He would greet me quietly, walk with me when I wanted company, leave me alone when I didn't. On my second visit, I stood for a long time in the main atrium looking at the building. It was a beautiful building. High ceilings, old light fixtures that I had had restored rather than replaced. A marble floor that had been there since 1931. I thought about the girl I had been, standing outside with her face pressed to the window. I thought about what Vivian had said in the kitchen. I thought patience. I thought not yet. I finished my coffee and I went back to work. There was a Thursday, about 6 months before the morning that changed everything, when Vivian called me. This was unusual. Vivian did not call me. She texted, occasionally efficient, warm enough texts, carefully calibrated, the kind you send when you want someone to feel included without actually including them. She did not call. I answered. "Margaret," she said, "I wanted to ask you something." I said, "Of course. Daniel and I have been talking about next year." A pause. "We're thinking about buying a house." "That's wonderful," I said. "We'd love something in the River District, close to where we are now, but obviously well, it's not cheap." Another pause. "Daniel said you might have some thoughts about, I don't know, whether there was anything you were planning to sort of organize in terms of." She did not finish the sentence. I said, "I'll think about it." She said, "Of course there's no rush." She said it the way people say things when there is, in fact, a rush. I said, "I'll look at what makes sense." And I thought, there it is. Not an accusation, I want to be clear about this. She had not done anything wrong exactly. She had asked a reasonable question in a somewhat oblique way. But the question told me exactly what she had been deciding about me and my money, and when she expected it to become available, and in what form. I said nothing more. I thanked her for calling. After I hung up, I sat with my tea for a while and looked out at the garden. I thought, she has no idea. She really has no idea. And I felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sorrow, something in between those two things, the feeling you get when a pattern finally completes itself and you see the whole shape of it clearly for the first time. I called George Fenn the next morning. Let me tell you what I am worth. Not because I am proud of it, I am, but that is not the point, but because you need to understand what was invisible in the room every time Vivian passed me the salt with that particular smile, every time she said home person, every time she sat me at the corner of the table and angled herself toward her mother. Chun Med Supply, in its current form, turned a revenue of approximately $42 million in the fiscal year that ended 3 months before the morning in Harrington's. The company held assets, equipment, contracts, inventory, intellectual property, worth considerably more than that. I owned it entirely. There were no partners, no co-investors, no silent shareholders. I had built it myself from the small importing business David had started with $12,000 in 1989 and my management of the books and my refusal to make the same mistake twice. Harrington's was a separate matter, valued conservatively at $11 million, with the transit corridor bringing it to considerably more within 18 months. The building on the north end of Meridian Street, the one where Vivian's company had their offices, generated annual lease income of roughly $240,000. I had owned it for 9 years. In those 9 years, Vivian's company had been my tenant for the last 4. She had never known. There were 3 other properties, 2 in this city, 1 in the city where my sister lived. All income generating, all held through structures that would not reveal my name to anyone who didn't know where to look. And then there were the investments. The careful, patient, disciplined investments that I had been making since 1994, when I had read a book about compound returns and decided, with the particular stubbornness that has defined most of my decisions, that I would treat every surplus dollar like a seed rather than a leaf. George Fenn had estimated my net worth in our last conversation at somewhere between $45 and $55 million, depending on which assets you counted and how you valued them. I drove a 2009 Camry with a dent above the rear left wheel well. I wore cardigans. I kept a vegetable garden that Vivian had described as charming, in a very rustic sort of way. And I was not going to be a problem. Understand is the thing no one understands about a woman like me, a woman who has spent 40 years building things quietly. The invisibility is not accidental. I was not invisible because I had failed to announce myself. I was invisible because I had chosen to be. Because I had learned very early that the world extends certain things to women who seem modest and unassuming. Access, information, candor. That it withholds from women who arrive in rooms announcing what they're worth. David used to say that the most powerful animal in the forest is the one the other animals don't see coming. I had always been that animal. The vegetable garden was real. I loved my vegetable garden. But it was not the whole of what I was. It was not even most of what I was. It was the part of me that I had chosen to make visible to the people who had decided, without asking, what I was worth. Vivian had decided. Daniel, without meaning to, had accepted her version. The whole comfortable architecture of my family's relationship with me was built on a misunderstanding so fundamental that when it collapsed, as it was going to collapse as it had to collapse, I suspected it would take a while for them to understand the scale of what they had missed. I did not intend to ruin anyone. I want to be clear about that. I am not a vindictive woman. Vindictive women waste energy. What I intended was much simpler. I intended to live my life honestly as myself, and to allow the truth of that life to surface in its own time, in its own way. I had been patient. I had been watchful. I had done everything that needed to be done. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in late October, Vivian called and asked if I wanted to come shopping. I should say. It was not unusual for Vivian to include me in these kinds of outings. She included me in things with the regularity of someone who understood that appearances mattered. That a daughter-in-law who never spent time with her mother-in-law would eventually have to explain why. She included me at a careful distance, present but not central, visible but not speaking. I was a prop in the story she was telling about herself. I understood this. I had understood it for quite some time. But I went. I went because I was curious, and because the particular Tuesday she had chosen was one when I had no commitments at the office, and because I had a feeling, the particular feeling I sometimes get, the one that has preceded most of the important moments of my life, that something was about to shift. She picked me up at 11. She was wearing a silk blouse in a deep navy blue that cost, I estimated, somewhere between $800 and $1,200. She was also wearing the particular expression she wore when she was feeling magnanimous about something. Open, warm, performing generosity. "I thought we could go to Harrington's," she said as I got into the car. "They've done it up beautifully apparently. And I need to find something for the Dawson dinner." I said, "That sounds nice." I thought, of all the places. Thought, well then. Thought, all right. I looked out the window as we drove and I watched the city pass. And I folded my hands in my lap, and I was, as I had been for years, entirely calm. The building looked good. I noticed this with a particular satisfaction that I carefully kept off my face. The facade had been cleaned. The window displays were strong. I had hired a new visual merchandising firm 8 months ago, and their work was evident in the composition, the palette, the sense of story in each window. The main entrance had new brass fittings that I had specified myself, the kind that age well, that look like they have always been there. Vivian did not know any of this. She walked through the entrance the way someone walks into a space that belongs to the world and is available to everyone, which is to say, with the easy confidence of a good customer. She noted the renovation with a small, satisfied nod. "Yes," she said, "much better. It was looking very tired for a while." I said, We went to the women's clothing floor. Now, I need to describe what happened next carefully because it happened in layers, the way things always do when two versions of reality occupy the same space. On the surface, we were two women looking at clothes. Vivian moved through the racks with the practiced efficiency of someone who shops the way other people breathe. Fluid expert. Certain of what she was looking for and how to find it. She pulled things, assessed them, replaced them or draped them over her arm, occasionally holding something up to her body in front of a mirror with the quick, unconscious confidence of a woman who knows exactly what suits her. I moved more slowly. I am a deliberate shopper when I shop at all. I touched fabrics. I looked at construction. I know what good fabric feels like. I have been feeling it for 60 years, and I know what poor construction looks like, and I am not fooled by price tags in either direction. And beneath the surface of this ordinary scene, I was watching Vivian and Paul Whitmore, who had seen us come in and recognized me immediately and was now conducting a very careful, very professional performance of not recognizing me, was watching both of us and making decisions about what to do. I will come to Paul in a moment. First, the moment. We had been on the floor for perhaps 20 minutes. Vivian had accumulated a small collection of things she intended to try. I had found and was holding a coat, a beautiful coat, a deep charcoal cashmere with a cut I recognized as exceptional and a lining I recognized as the work of a manufacturer I had been admiring for years. I held it. I looked at it. I decided I was going to buy it. Vivian came to stand beside me. She looked at the coat. Then she looked at me. Then she looked back at the coat with an expression that passed through her face so quickly that someone less practiced at watching than I am would have missed it entirely. Then she smiled. "Oh, that's beautiful," she said. And she said it in exactly the right tone, warm, genuine sounding, admirably controlled. But I heard, underneath it, the second sentence. The one she didn't say out loud. The one that was contained in the microscopic flicker of her eyes from the coat to my cardigan to the coat again. In the slight adjustment of her smile that told me she had already done the mental arithmetic. She didn't say, "That coat costs $2,400 and you are a woman who drives a Camry and wears sensible shoes and your gutters need cleaning." She said, "Is it for a special occasion? A small thing. Nothing anyone could point to. The kind of thing you could replay 100 times and still not be certain you had heard correctly." But I was certain. I looked at the coat in my hands. Thought, there it is. I thought, patience. I said, I think I'll try it on. And then Paul Whitmore walked over. Underscore had been the floor manager at Harrington's for 11 years, the last 8 of those under my ownership. He was 54, methodical, possessed of a quiet professional intelligence that I had recognized and valued when I took over the store. He knew me. He knew me well. He had seen me come in through the side entrance, and he had understood, as he always understood on those visits, that I preferred not to be identified to the general public while I moved through the store. But this was a different situation. And Paul, in the moment that I held the coat and Vivian said, "Is it for a special occasion?" with that particular smile, made a judgment call. He walked across the floor. He walked the way he always walked, professionally, unhurriedly, without the slight performative bustle that junior staff often used to signal importance. He approached us directly. He stopped in front of me, and he bowed. Not deeply, not the formal bow of a ceremony. A small genuine bow. The bow of a man acknowledging someone he respects. "Miss Chun," he said. "I'm so glad you came in today." And Vivian went very still. Underscore underscore. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Linda's Life Diaries. The best ones are still coming. And the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear them. Underscore. I want to stay in this moment for a little while. Because it is easy in a story like this one to rush toward the reveal, to let the pleasure of vindication carry the narrative forward without pausing to describe what it actually felt like to be standing there. What it felt like was this: it felt quiet. That is the word. Not triumphant, not satisfying, not cruel quiet. The particular quiet of a truth surfacing after a long time underwater. The way a room changes when you stop pretending. The way your shoulders relax when you finally put down something you have been carrying for longer than was necessary. Paul was still standing there, composed and professional, waiting. Vivian was still standing there, something rearranging itself behind her eyes. And I was standing there, holding a coat I fully intended to purchase. And I was 63 years old, and I had built more than most people will ever see. And I had been patient for long enough. I looked at Paul. I said in my ordinary voice, the one I have been using for 63 years. "Thank you, Paul. I was just looking at this coat," he said. "The cashmere is exceptional this season. We got it directly from the same mill we've used for 4 years now. I think it would suit you very well." Vivian said nothing. I said to Paul, "I'll take it." And then, because I am not a woman who wastes a moment when the moment has arrived, but also because there is a right way to do things and I have always believed in doing things the right way, I turned to Vivian. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not embarrassment, not quite, not yet, but the precursor to it. The expression of someone who has just understood that the room they are standing in is different from the room they thought they were in. I said, "Shall we find what you need for the Dawson dinner?" My voice was warm. Entirely warm. I was not performing warmth, I was warm. I am generally a warm woman. I had simply also been a patient one. She said, "Yes, of course." And we continued shopping. In the dressing room corridor, while Vivian was trying on a silk dress behind a closed door, Paul came to stand beside me with the kind of quiet professionalism that I had always appreciated about him. He said very softly, "I hope that was all right." I said, "It was fine, Paul. Thank you." He said, "She was." He paused. "I thought it was the right call." I looked at him. "It was the right call," I said. "Sometimes the right call is the right call." He nodded. He went back to his work. I stood in the corridor and I thought about my vegetable garden. I thought about the dent above the left rear wheel well of the Camry. I thought about the cardigans in my closet and the congee I would make on Sunday morning and the life I had built and the life I had chosen to show the world and the gap between those two things, which was, it turned out, considerable. I thought, now it begins. Not the ending. The beginning. Because the moment in the store was not the reckoning. It was the first visible signal of something that had been true for a very long time, surfacing finally into air. The reckoning, the real one, the complete one, the one that would require Vivian and Daniel to understand the full scope of what they had not known, that was still to come. I had been patient for years. I could be patient for a little longer. Vivian came out of the dressing room in the silk dress. It was beautiful on her. Genuinely was. I said, "That's the one." She looked at me. I smiled. The drive home was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of two women who have spent a pleasant morning together and have said everything they needed to say. The other kind. The quiet that fills a car when someone is thinking very carefully about something and does not want you to know they are thinking about it. Vivian drove. She drove the way she always drove, precise, confident, two hands on the wheel, the kind of driver who signals early and keeps careful following distance. But there was something in the set of her jaw that I had not seen there before. A small tightness. The physical trace of a recalibration happening behind her eyes. I sat in the passenger seat with my coat in a bag on my lap and I watched the city go by and I said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments and I let her think. She needed to think. She had, in the space of approximately 45 seconds on the women's clothing floor, received information that disrupted a story she had been telling herself for 2 years. That kind of disruption takes time to process. I understood this. I was patient with it. She said just before we turned onto Whitfield Lane. "So Paul, he manages the floor there?" I said. "He manages the women's clothing floor, yes." A pause. She said. "He seemed to know you quite well." I said. "I've been in a few times." True as far as it went. It's a beautiful store. I've always loved the building. Another pause. "Longer." She said. "Yes. It is." She pulled up in front of my house. She kept the engine running. The particular engine running of someone who is not planning to come in. I said, "Thank you for the morning. I'm glad we went." She said, "Me too." And then very carefully, very casually, in the tone of someone who has rehearsed the casualness. "How do you know him, Paul?" I looked at her. I smiled the way I have been smiling for 63 years, warm, genuine, entirely unreadable. I said, "The way you know people. Over time." I got out of the car. I walked up the path. I heard her drive away. Inside, I set the coat down on the kitchen table. I put the kettle on. I stood at the window and looked at the garden and I thought, so it begins to unravel. Not in a way she would be able to name yet. Not in a way that would feel, from the outside, like anything other than a small, odd moment in an otherwise ordinary morning. But the thread had been pulled. The question had been asked. And Vivian, who was not a stupid woman, I want to emphasize this because it matters, Vivian was the kind of person who, once she had asked a question, did not stop pulling the thread until she understood where it led. Which meant that somewhere in the near future she was going to start looking. And I needed to be ready for what she found. I called Clara that evening. Not about Harrington's. I did not tell Clara about Harrington's, not yet. I called about something more practical. We had been in the middle of a review of the holding structure for the second property on the east side, and I wanted to make sure certain documents were where they were supposed to be before anyone who was curious started asking questions. Clara said, "Everything's clean, Aunt Margaret. Has been for months." I said, "Good." She said, "Did something happen?" I said, "No." A pause. Clara is very good at pauses. She has learned this from me. She said, "All right. I'll have the review finished by Thursday." I said, "Thank you, Clara." I hung up and I drank my tea and I thought about what was coming. Not with anxiety, I want to be clear about that. I had been preparing for this for 2 years. Everything that needed to be in order was in order. The only thing that had changed was the timing. Vivian's question in the car had moved something from the abstract future into the concrete present. I thought about the expression on her face in the store when Paul had bowed. That moment of stillness. That rearrangement behind the eyes. I thought, she is going to ask Daniel. I thought. And Daniel is going to have to admit he doesn't know. And I thought, That will be the beginning of the real conversation. The one we should have had 2 years ago. The one I had been waiting, patiently, quietly, for exactly the right moment to have. Daniel called on the Sunday after Harrington's. He called at the usual time, 10 in the morning, the way he had called every Sunday for 15 years, a habit so fixed it had become its own kind of love. He said, "Mom, how are you?" I said, "I'm well. How are you?" He said, "Good, good." A pause. "Vivian mentioned you two went shopping." I said, "We had a nice morning." Another pause. Slightly longer. He said, "She said you ran into someone at Harrington's. A manager who knew you." I said, "Paul Whitmore. He manages the women's clothing floor. I've been in a few times." I heard Daniel thinking. I knew that particular quality of his silence. It was the silence of a man trying to fit a small new piece of information into a picture he had thought was complete. He said, "Vivian seemed a little," he searched for the word, "curious about it." I said, "It was a lovely store. You should go sometime." He laughed. A small, slightly puzzled laugh. "Sure, Mom." We talked about other things. The kanji I had made that morning. A documentary he was watching. A project at his work. It was a good conversation, warm and easy, the way our conversations had always been when it was just the two of us. But when we hung up, I sat for a long time and thought about the quality of that pause. The searching. The Vivian seemed a little curious. Daniel was starting to notice that there was something he hadn't been noticing. This is always the most delicate stage. The stage when the person who has been missing information begins to understand that they have been missing it, but doesn't yet know how much. It is the stage that requires the most care, because it is the stage when people are most likely to make fast decisions based on incomplete pictures. They see one corner of something large and they construct the rest of it from what they expect to see rather than what is there. I needed Daniel to move slowly, to ask questions carefully, to come to understanding the way you come to it when you are allowed to move at your own pace, not pushed, not pulled, not alarmed. So I did what I had been doing for 2 years. I said nothing more than what was asked. I answered the questions I was asked with the truth, and I allowed the unanswered questions to remain unanswered until someone found the courage to ask them directly. Understand 3 days after that Sunday call, Vivian came by. This was unusual. Vivian did not come by on weekdays. She was at work on weekdays, and when she was not at work, she had the kind of social life that did not leave much room for unscheduled visits to her mother-in-law's house in the suburbs. Her visits to me were planned, calendared, executed with the precision of someone who manages their time professionally. She called ahead, I will give her that. She said she was in the area, and wondered if she could stop by for a few minutes. I said, "Of course." She arrived at 2:30. She was still in work clothes, the silk blouse was gone, replaced by something in a pale gray that I recognized as being from the same tier of expense. She looked beautiful, as she always looked beautiful, and slightly distracted, as she had looked since Harrington's. I made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the garden through the back window and accepted the tea and held it with both hands the way her mother did. We talked about nothing for a little while. The Dawson dinner she was preparing for. A friend's renovation. The weather which had turned cold. And then she said, in the particular tone she used when she had decided to be direct and was framing the directness as casual, "Margaret, can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "The store, Harrington's. The man who came over." I waited. She said, "He addressed you very formally. Miss Chen. Not, he didn't say can I help you the way you'd expect. He seemed to, I don't know. It was just noticeable." I held my tea. I looked at her. I said, "Paul has always been very professional." She said, "Yes, but," she stopped. She tried again. "Is there something, do you have some kind of connection to the store? Beyond just shopping there?" This was the moment. Not the biggest moment that was still coming, but a moment the kind that has a weight to it that requires a decision. I could have told her then. I could have sat back in my chair and said, "Yes, Vivian, I own it. I have owned it for 3 years. I also own the building where your office is. I also run a company that turns $42 million in revenue, and I have been sitting at the corner of your dinner table for 2 years while you decided I was not going to be a problem. I could have. I chose not to. Not because the moment didn't call for truth, it did, truth was coming, but because there is a right way to do things. Truth delivered in a kitchen over afternoon tea, in response to a half-formed question, is not the truth I had spent 2 years preparing. It is a messy truth. An incomplete truth. A truth that gets tangled in the wrong conversation at the wrong time. I said. I've been involved with the store for a while. Paul knows me. I kept my voice warm and my face neutral, and I let that sentence sit in the air between us. Vivian looked at me. She was trying to read something in my expression that I was not putting there. She said, "How involved?" I said, "Quite involved." And then I said, "More tea?" And she said yes, and I poured it, and we moved on to other things, and she left 40 minutes later looking, for the first time since I had known her, slightly off balance. Not much. Vivian was never very off balance. But enough. Understanding. I called George Fenn. I said, "I think we're entering the active phase." He said, "What happened?" I told him about Harrington's, about Paul, about Vivian's visit. He said, "How much does she know?" I said, "She knows something is different from what she thought. She doesn't know what yet." He said, "Do you want me to prepare anything specific?" I said, "Yes. I'd like you to prepare a clear summary, everything in order, structured for someone who has not previously had access to this information. Not a legal document. A narrative. Something a person could read and understand." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "For Daniel." I said, "For Daniel." Another pause. He said, "Margaret, you've been carrying this for a long time." I said, "I know." He said, "I'll have it ready by the end of the week." Understand. The second thing that happened was smaller, and I might have missed it if I had not been watching very carefully. Daniel called me on the Wednesday after Vivian's visit. This was not unusual. He called when he had something on his mind outside the Sunday routine. What was unusual was that he called at 7 in the evening, which meant he was home, which meant Vivian was likely also home, which meant he had found a reason to call from somewhere private. He said, "Mom, I was wondering your work. Chunmed." I said, "Yes." He said, "How's it going? Like, how is it really? I feel like I don't ask enough." This stopped me. Not the question itself, it was a simple question, but the fact of it. He had not asked me this question in approximately 2 years. He had not asked it since Vivian had begun managing the shape of our family's conversations. The fact that he was asking it now, on a Wednesday evening from somewhere private, that told me something. I said, "It's going very well, actually." He said, "Yeah? What does that mean, very well?" I said, "It means I'm proud of it. It means we've grown considerably in the last several years. It means the work we've been doing on the contract side is starting to pay off in a significant way." A pause. He said, "I guess I never really understood the scale of it." I said, "You never really asked." A beat of silence. Not defensive, just honest. I had not said it unkindly. I had said it the way you say a true thing that needs to be said. He said, "No, I didn't." I said, "I'm happy to tell you more if you'd like to know." He said, "Yeah, I think I would." We talked for an hour. It was one of the best conversations we had had in years. Genuinely good, the kind of conversation that happens when two people who love each other stop performing their assigned roles and speak plainly. I told him things I had never told him because he had never asked, and he listened with the focused attention of a man who is understanding slowly that the picture he has been looking at is smaller than the painting it belongs to. I did not tell him everything. Not yet. The summary George was preparing was not yet ready. And there was a right order to these things, a sequence that mattered. But I told him enough that when we hung up, he said quietly, in the voice of someone who is just beginning to see, "Mom, I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I'm sorry. I said. There's nothing to be sorry for yet. There will be things to talk about. We'll talk about them. He said. Okay. I said. I love you, Daniel. He said. I love you too, Mom. The third thing that happened was Vivian asking Daniel what he knew about ChunMed Supply. I was not present for this conversation. I learned about it obliquely, in the way you learn about most significant conversations, through the changed quality of subsequent interactions. Daniel called again 2 days later, and there was something different in his voice. A new alertness, the sound of a man who has recently discovered a room in a house he thought he knew completely. He said, Mom, I've been doing a little reading. I said, about what? He said, about the company. I googled ChunMed Supply. A pause. There's more there than I realized. I said, there usually is. He said, why haven't you talked about it more? I thought about this question. It was a fair question. It deserved a fair answer. I said, because no one asked for a long time. And after a while, the gap between what people assumed and what was true got so wide that filling it started to feel like a whole conversation, not a small correction. And I was waiting for the right time to have that whole conversation. He was quiet. I said, the right time is coming, Daniel. I'd like to sit down with you properly. Just you and me and George Fenn, and I'll walk you through everything. All of it. He said. Is something wrong? I said. Nothing is wrong. I want you to understand what you're going to inherit. I want you to understand it clearly, so that your decisions going forward are based on accurate information. Another silence. Longer. He said. Vivian asked me about the building on Meridian Street. I did not react. I said. What about it? He said. She looked up the ownership. She was curious about Harrington's and she went down a bit of a rabbit hole. A pause. She found a company name. Chun Holdings. I said. Yes. A long pause. He said. Mom. I said. Yes, Daniel. He said. Is Chun Holdings? I said. Yes. The word landed in the silence between us and settled there. He said very quietly. The building where Vivian works. I said. Yes. He said. For how long? I said. 9 years. I heard him breathe. Just breathe. He said. She's been your tenant for 4 years. I said. Yes. He said. She doesn't know. I said. She doesn't know. Another long silence. I let it sit. I did not rush it or fill it or soften it. Some things need to be sat with. He said. I think we need to have that meeting. I said. I think so too. He said. Should I bring Vivian? I thought about this. I thought about Paul Whitmore on the floor of Harrington's. I thought about Vivian's face when he bowed. I thought about all the Sundays at the corner of the table, all the home persons, all the not going to be a problems. I said, yes, bring Vivian. I want to say something here. Because I think it matters. This was never a trap. I understand why it might look like one. I understand that from the outside, from Vivian's outside especially, the sequence of events has a particular shape. The patient, invisible mother-in-law who turned out to be something entirely different. The building she didn't know was owned by the woman she had been managing. The store she walked into without understanding whose floor she was walking on. I understand that from the outside this looks like a long game. A slow-motion revenge. It wasn't. I built what I built because I loved building it. I maintained the holding structures I maintained because that is how you protect what you have built, carefully, privately, through structures that don't announce themselves. I bought Harrington's because the building was beautiful and the block was going to be worth 3 times what I paid for it, and because I had stood outside it once as a young woman with nothing in her pockets and I wanted simply to own the place that had felt so far from her. I did not buy Harrington's to embarrass Vivian. I did not maintain Chun Holdings as a holding company for the express purpose of being her landlord. I did not acquire the building on Meridian Street while imagining the day her marketing company would move into the 3rd floor. None of that was strategy. All of that was life moving in its own direction, building on itself the way things build when you make patient decisions over a long period of time. What was deliberate was the silence. The silence was a choice. Not a calculated revenge, but a considered decision to allow the people in my life to show me who they were before I showed them who I was. To let the room develop fully before I turned on the lights. I had learned this from 40 years of building things that other people underestimated until they couldn't anymore. And now the lights were coming on. Not because I had planned this exact moment, the coat, Paul's bow, Vivian's rabbit hole, Daniel's phone call. I had not planned any of that. Moments like that one in Harrington's are not planned. They arrive when the conditions are right, the way certain things only bloom in certain seasons. What I had planned was to be ready when the moment came. I was ready. George's summary arrived on a Thursday. He sent it to me in a format we had agreed on, clear, sequential, organized the way a good accountant organizes things, from the foundation up. It covered ChunMed's supply in full. The properties. The investments. The holding structures. The value as best as anyone could estimate it. It was 41 pages. I read it the way I read most things I have already lived. Quickly checking for accuracy, noting the places where the language needed to be plain rather than technical. I made 7 notes in the margins. I sent them back to George with a short message. Simplify these sections. Daniel is intelligent but not a lawyer. Vivian is intelligent but also not a lawyer. Right for a person encountering this for the first time. He sent the revised version back in 2 days. I read it again. It was right. I called Daniel. I said, Saturday. My house. 11 in the morning. He said, we'll be there. I said, and Daniel, he said. Yes. I said, come ready to listen. That's all I'm asking. Just come ready to listen. He said with a warmth that told me he had already been doing a great deal of thinking. I will, Mom. I promise. For Friday before the Saturday, Clara came by. She did not come by often. We generally kept our personal and professional lives somewhat separate, not rigidly but by preference. When she came to my house, it meant something specific. She sat at my kitchen table and I made her congee and she ate it the way she had eaten it since she was 12, with a sprinkle of the white pepper I keep for exactly this purpose, and she said, Are you nervous? I said, No. She said, I'd be nervous. I said, I know what I have built. I have always known. The nervousness would have been in building it wrong. The building is done. She was quiet for a moment. She said, What do you think she's going to say? Vivian. I thought about this. I said, I think she's going to go through several things in a fairly short period of time. I think she'll start with disbelief, then move to something that looks like calculation, trying to understand what it means for her position, and then settle eventually into something more genuine. Maybe not at the meeting. Maybe not for a while after. But eventually, Clara said. And Daniel. I said, Daniel is going to be fine. Daniel has been a good son. He missed things he should have asked about, but he missed them the way good people miss things, not because he was calculating but because no one told him to look. She nodded. She said, What do you want from them? Really? What do you actually want? I looked at the garden. The last of the autumn light was coming through at a low angle, the way light in late October comes through, slanted, golden, making everything look temporarily more beautiful than it usually is. I said, I want to be seen as what I am. Not as more than I am. Not as less. Just accurately. Clara looked at me for a long moment. She said, That's a very reasonable thing to want. I said, Yes. I've always thought so. She finished her congee. She stayed for another cup of tea. She left at 4, hugging me at the door the way she had hugged me since she was 12, slightly fierce, the embrace of someone who means it. I stood in the doorway after she left and I looked at the street. Quiet autumn bare, my neighbor's maple letting go of its last leaves in the still air, and I thought about Saturday. I thought about the 41 pages in the folder on my kitchen counter. I thought about Paul Whitmore, moving across the floor of Harrington's with the quiet professional certainty of a man making the right call. I thought about the coat, which I had hung in my closet on the left side, next to the cardigans. I thought tomorrow. I went inside. I made dinner. I went to bed early and I slept well. The deep, grounded sleep of a woman who has finished preparing and is ready simply for what comes next. Saturday arrived the way important days always do, without fanfare. The sky was the particular pale gray of late October, the kind that holds the light flat and even the kind that makes colors look more themselves rather than more dramatic. The maple in my neighbor's yard had finished losing its leaves. The garden was down to its bones, which I have always found, personally, more beautiful than its summer fullness. There is something honest about a garden in November. It shows you exactly what it is. I woke at 6. I made congee. The slow kind, the kind that takes an hour and a half and fills the house with a warmth that is partly steam and partly something older than that. Something that has to do with the particular smell of ginger and the particular sound of a pot that has been on the stove long enough to know what it's doing. I made enough for 4 people, because I am my mother's daughter and my mother believed that adequate food was the foundation of any honest conversation. I set the table the way I always set it for important occasions, not formally, not with the good china that lives in the back of the cabinet, but carefully. Placemats. The everyday dishes which are good dishes, white with a thin blue rim. The teapot I have had for 20 years. Glasses for water. George Fenn arrived at 10. He was punctual as he always was, and he came in through the back door the way he always came in, quietly without ceremony, carrying his briefcase and a paper bag from the bakery on Birch Street. He set the bakery bag on the counter without comment. He said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Ready." He said, "Good." He opened the briefcase. "Copies of everything?" I said, 4. 1 each. He nodded. He arranged the folders on the counter in a neat stack and he accepted the cup of tea I offered him and he sat at the kitchen table and he was quiet in the particular way that George has always been quiet, attentively, without filling the silence with noise. We sat together until 10:50. We talked about small things, a case he had recently closed, a development along the waterfront he thought I might be interested in. We did not talk about what was about to happen. There was nothing left to say about what was about to happen. We had said it all over 2 years of careful preparation, and now the preparation was done and what remained was simply the thing itself. At 10:58 I heard a car in the driveway. Daniel came in first. He kissed my cheek the way he always did. His left hand light on my shoulder. The brief pressure of someone who means the gesture rather than performs it. He looked at me for a moment longer than usual and I saw in his face the things I had heard in his voice on the phone. The alertness, the new quality of attention, the slight weight of a man who has recently understood that a room is larger than he thought. He said, "Mom." I said, "Come in. Sit down." Vivian came in behind him. I want to describe her carefully because she deserves to be described carefully. She was wearing a coat I had not seen before, dark green, well-cut, expensive, and her hair was done the way she wore it for occasions she had decided were significant. She had decided this was a significant occasion. She was right, but she did not know yet, I thought, in quite what way. She looked at George Fenn. She looked at the folders on the counter. She looked at me. She said, "Margaret." I said, "Vivian, come in. There's congee if you'd like some." Something crossed her face, the smallest flicker of the unexpected, because she had come prepared for a certain kind of meeting and congee was not part of it. Then she composed herself because Vivian was excellent at composing herself and she said, "Thank you. We ate first." This was intentional. I have found, over 63 years, that important conversations go better when the people having them have eaten something warm. It is difficult to be entirely defensive or entirely frightened when you are holding a bowl of congee that someone made for you. The stomach has its own kind of wisdom. Daniel ate with the focused appetite of a man who needed something to do with his hands. Vivian ate more slowly, watching me, watching George, watching the folders on the counter. She was trying to read the room. She was very good at reading rooms. But this was a room she had not been in before. George was quiet and professional and ate his congee with the composed appreciation of a man who has sat at many tables for many important conversations and understands that the table itself is part of the work. When the bowls were empty and the tea had been poured and we had been sitting together long enough that the sitting together itself had become its own kind of statement, I said, "Thank you both for coming." Daniel said, "Of course." Vivian said, "Of course." Her voice was controlled. Her hands around her teacup were entirely still. I said, "I'd like George to walk us through some things. And then I'd like us to talk." I looked at them both, at Daniel, who was leaning slightly forward, ready, and at Vivian, who was very straight, very composed, her face arranged in the expression of someone who does not intend to be surprised. I thought, she is going to be surprised. I thought, that's all right. I said, "George." And George Fenn opened the first folder. George was methodical. He had been practicing law for 31 years and he had sat in many rooms and explained many things to many people, and he understood that the way information is delivered determines to a significant degree how it is received. He did not begin with the largest number. He began at the beginning. He began with ChunMed Supply. He explained its founding, David's beginning, my management of the books, the years of early growth. He explained the transition after David's death, the restructuring I had undertaken, the decisions I had made, the careful building of what had been a promising small business into something considerably larger. He explained the revenue. He explained the contracts. He explained the asset structure. Daniel was very still. He was listening the way he had listened as a child when something interested him completely, with his whole body leaning slightly toward the source. Vivian's composure did not break. But it shifted. The way a very well-built wall shifts when the ground beneath it begins to move. Not crumbling, not falling, but registering a change in conditions. George moved through the properties. The two on the east side of the city. The one in my sister's city. The building on Meridian Street. When he said the building on Meridian Street, I watched Vivian's face. She knew. She had already found it through her own research. Daniel had told me as much. But knowing something from a search result is different from sitting in a kitchen and hearing a lawyer say it clearly, in your presence with your husband beside you with his mother across the table. She said nothing. Her hands remained still around her teacup. But something in her eyes changed. A depth that had not been there when she walked in. The depth of a person who is beginning to understand the full dimensions of a thing they had thought they already understood. George said, "Miss Chun acquired the property 9 years ago. It was leased in full to commercial tenants from the beginning. Your company, Vivian, took the 3rd floor 4 years ago." A silence. Daniel looked at Vivian. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the table. He said, quietly, not accusingly, just the plain statement of a man making a calculation. 4 years. I said, "Yes." He said, "She's been your tenant for 4 years and she didn't know." I said, "No." Another silence. Vivian had still not spoken. I watched her, the way I had been watching her for 2 years, and I saw something happening in her face that I had not expected to see quite yet. Not calculation, not defensiveness, not anger. Something quieter than any of those things. Something that looked at its edges like genuine recognition. George continued. He moved to Harrington's. When he said the name, Harrington Department Store, acquired 3 years ago, currently valued at approximately $11 million with the projected transit corridor appreciation bringing that figure to considerably more within 18 months. Vivian closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Just a second. Then she opened them and she looked at me. And I looked back at her. And between us in that look, the full picture of Tuesday morning on the women's clothing floor passed through the air and completed itself. The coat, Paul's bow, Miss Chun, I've been in a few times, and Vivian asking me in the car, with her careful casualness, "He seemed to know you quite well. He managed the floor of a store I owned." She had been shopping in a store I owned and she had not known. George finished with the investments. He gave the total. He set down his pen. He said, in the particular tone he uses for endings, "That's the complete picture as it currently stands." The kitchen was very quiet. The light outside had shifted while George was talking. The pale gray had warmed slightly, the way October light sometimes does when it has been building all morning toward something. The congee pot was still on the stove. The bakery bag was still on the counter. The teapot was still warm. Daniel said, And there was something in his voice that was not quite any one thing, that was several things layered. Mom. I said. Yes. He said. Why didn't you tell me? I had thought about how to answer this question. I had been thinking about it in various forms for 2 years. I said. Because you didn't ask. He opened his mouth. I raised my hand gently, the way you raise your hand with someone you love when you want them to let you finish. I said. I don't mean that as a reproach. I mean it as a fact. In the 2 years since Daniel and I got married, no one at the table ever said, Margaret, tell me about your work. Margaret, what does Chanmed do? Margaret, how are things going? Not because you don't love me, I know you love me. But because the story that was being told about who I was didn't leave room for the answers to those questions. I looked at Vivian when I said this. She was looking at the table. I said, I have been sitting at the corner of the dinner table for 2 years. I have been described more than once as a home person. I have been told indirectly in conversations that were not quite private enough that I was not going to be a problem. I paused. I want you to understand that I heard those things. I heard all of them. And I said nothing because I was waiting. Daniel said. Waiting for what? I said. Waiting for the right time to have this conversation. And waiting to see who you both were underneath the roles you were playing. Because you were playing roles, both of you. Vivian was playing the role of the woman who manages the family. Daniel, you were playing the role of the man who trusts his wife's management of things. Those are not bad roles. But they were built on a picture of me that was incomplete. And I wanted to give the picture time to surface on its own before I brought it into the light. Vivian spoke for the first time since George had finished. She said in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet. The store. I looked at her. She said. When I said about the coat, I said, is it for a special occasion? I said. Yes. She said. And you already knew? I said. I already knew. A very long silence. She said. I didn't mean. She stopped. She looked at her hands. And then she did something I had not seen her do in 2 years of Sunday dinners and carefully managed conversations. She stopped performing. The composure was still there. Vivian was not a woman who lost her composure easily, and I respected that, but the performance behind it had stopped. What remained was something plainer and more genuine. She said. I've been very stupid. I said, no. You've been working with the information you had. She said. I decided what you were without asking. I said. Yes. She said. And you let me. I said. I let you. Because I needed to know who you were when you thought no one important was watching. The silence that followed this was the deepest silence of the morning. Daniel looked at the table. Vivian looked at me. George sat with his hands folded, the way he always sat when he understood that the legal portion of the morning was over, and what remained was something his training had not covered. Daniel said, I should have asked, Mom. I should have asked years ago. I said, yes. He said, I'm sorry. I looked at my son. My good, warm, not quite careful enough son, who had loved me his whole life and had allowed someone else's version of me to substitute for the real one because the real one had never demanded to be seen. I said, I know you are. And I forgive you for that easily, completely. There is nothing to forgive. But I need you to understand something going forward. I paused. What I have built is real. What I have done over 30 years is real. I do not need you to be impressed by it. I do not need it to change how you see me or how you treat me. But I need it to be acknowledged. I need to be known as what I am. He said. You are. You will be. I promise. I believed him. I turned to Vivian. I want to describe this moment carefully because it is the one that required the most of me. More than the building, more than the patience, more than the years of sitting at the corner of the table and saying nothing when I could have said everything. Vivian was looking at me. Her composure was still present because she was Vivian, and Vivian's composure was structural rather than cosmetic. It was built into her, not applied over her. But beneath it, something had reorganized. The certainty that had defined her face for the 2 years I had known her, the small, pleasant, managing certainty of a woman who believed she understood the room, was gone. In its place was something that I thought, with some care, might eventually become something valuable. She let it. I said. Vivian. She said. I know. I said. I'm not sure you do yet. But you will. She looked at me for a long moment. And then she said something that surprised me. Not the words themselves, but the tone behind them, which was entirely unguarded in a way I had not heard from her before. She said. Why didn't you ever say anything? Not just today. Any of it. All this time. I said. Because I wanted to be chosen. Not managed. Not maneuvered around. Not made invisible in my own family's story. I kept my voice even, not cold, not accusatory, simply clear. I wanted someone to look at me and decide of their own free will that I was worth knowing. Not because I announced my net worth. Because I was present and patient and available and real, and that was enough. She was quiet. I said. And I wanted you to be the kind of person who would make that choice. I am still hoping you will be. The still landed softly. It was not a threat. It was not a dismissal. It was an opening. A door left at exactly the right width. Not wide enough to pretend nothing had happened, not closed enough to suggest there was nothing to walk toward. Vivian looked at the table. Then she looked at her husband. Then she looked back at me. She said. I treated you like you weren't important. I said. Yes. She said. I made assumptions. I said. Yes. She said. And you watched the whole time. I said. I did. A pause. She said. That must have been. She stopped. She started again. I don't know if I could have done that. Stayed that quiet for that long. I said. I've had a lot of practice. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile. The moment was too weighted for a smile. But something in her expression moved. The way expressions move when a person has just heard something that will rearrange how they understand a situation they thought they already understood. She said. What do you want from us? Going forward. This was, I thought, the right question. The direct question. The one that acknowledged that something had changed and asked plainly what to do with the change. I said. I want to sit at the table. Not the corner. The table. I said it simply without drama because it was a simple thing. I want to be asked about my work. I want to be included in decisions that involve me. I paused, finding the right words. I want to be known as what I am. By both of you. That is all I have ever wanted. Daniel said, with a steadiness that told me he was being entirely honest. You will be. I give you my word. Vivian said nothing immediately. She was looking at the table, her hands flat on the surface, thinking with the visible concentration of a person who is doing real work inside themselves. Then she looked up. She said, I'd like to start over. If you'll let me. I looked at her for a long moment. I looked at her the way I had been looking at her for 2 years, carefully, without assumptions, paying attention to what was actually there rather than what I expected to find. What I found in that moment was genuine. Not perfect. Not polished, not managed. Not the warm performance she had been conducting for my benefit on Sunday afternoons. Genuine. The face of a woman who had been, for a very short time this morning, exactly herself. I said, yes. I'll let you. Undershirters left at 1 o'clock. He shook my hand at the door, and in his handshake was everything the morning had been. The 2 years of preparation, the 41 pages, the quiet professional certainty of a man who understood that the legal work had always been in service of something much older and more important than law. He said, Well done, Margaret. I said, Thank you, George. For everything. He nodded. He went to his car. I watched him go. Daniel and Vivian stayed until 3. After George left, something in the room relaxed. Not completely. The morning had been too significant for everything to simply dissolve into easy warmth, but enough. The kind of relaxation that happens when people have moved through something difficult together and arrived, still intact, on the other side. We sat in the living room. I brought out the rest of the congee and we ate it standing in the kitchen, the three of us, the way you eat when formality has been set aside. Vivian had taken off her coat. Daniel had rolled up his sleeves. Something about it reminded me, briefly and painfully, of the early days of my marriage. The kitchen, the warmth, the ordinary intimacy of standing together over food. We talked. Not about the finances, those were handled, documented, set aside for the practical conversations that would follow over the coming weeks. We talked about other things. About Daniel's father, whom I had not spoken about to either of them in a long time, and who deserved to be spoken about. About the early years of ChonMed, which were not glamorous. They were difficult, lean, full of the particular unglamorous work of keeping a small company solvent while also keeping a child fed and a household running. About the flood of 2009, which Vivian had not heard about, and which had come within 2 weeks of taking everything I had managed to build in the 15 years since David's death. Vivian listened to the flood story with the focused attention I was beginning to understand was her real mode, not the managed warmth she had been performing for Sunday dinners, but the sharp, genuine interest of a woman who is actually curious when she permits herself to be. She said, "How did you save it?" I said, "I called in every favor I had accumulated in 15 years of business, and I made a decision very fast, to move the inventory to a warehouse I didn't own, but whose owner owed me a significant debt of professional courtesy. And I didn't sleep for 11 days. She said, 11 days. I said, give or take. She said, and you did that alone. I said, Clara helped. She was 19. She drove the first truck herself. Vivian looked at Daniel. Something passed between them. Not a word, just a look, the private language of two people who have been together long enough to communicate without speaking. I did not try to read it. It belonged to them. Daniel said, Mom, I want to ask you something. I said, yes. He said, were you ever angry? At us? At how things were? I thought about this carefully. I wanted to give him an honest answer. I said, I was patient. Patience and anger are not the same thing, but they are not entirely separate either. There were moments. I paused. There were things I heard that I did not enjoy hearing. There were Sunday dinners where I sat at the corner of the table and I thought, this is not accurate. This is not who I am. And I am allowing it because I have chosen to, but it is costing me something. He said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. You've said so. And I believe you. He said, I mean it specifically. Not just generally. I mean, I should have been curious about you. I should have asked more. You're my mother and I know you less well than I should because I stopped asking somewhere along the way and He stopped. I'm sorry for that specifically. This I thought was the thing I had waited for. Not the revelation of what I owned. Not the correction of Vivian's assumptions. This, my son, in my kitchen, being honest about a specific failure in a way that only a person who genuinely loved you could be honest about. I said, thank you. He said, we'll do better. I said, I know you will. Understand, asked, before they left, if she could see the coat. I brought it out from the closet. She held it carefully the way you hold something that has a weight to it beyond the physical, and she looked at it for a moment. She said, it's beautiful. I said, I know. She handed it back. And then she said in a voice that was entirely quiet and entirely genuine, I'm embarrassed about what I implied. In the store. I said, I know. She said, I didn't say it out loud. I said, you didn't need to. A pause. She said, I've been doing that for a long time. Deciding what people are worth without. I've been doing it to you specifically, but I don't think it's only you. I looked at her. This was, I thought, perhaps the most honest thing she had said since I had known her. Not an apology exactly, or not only an apology. A recognition. The kind that only comes when the ground has shifted enough that the old way of seeing no longer works. I said, I think that's probably worth sitting with. She said, yes. She looked at the coat one more time. She said, for what it's worth, it suits you. It always would have. I said, I know that too. They left at 3. I stood at the door and watched them go to the car. Daniel with his arm around her shoulders, Vivian leaning into him very slightly, the two of them talking in the low voices of people working something out together. I watched them until they turned the corner at the end of the street. Then I went back inside. I washed the congee bowls. I put the teapot away. I folded the dish towel with the edges aligned the way I have always folded it, the way I taught Daniel to fold it when he was 7 years old and wanted to help. I went to the back door and I looked at the garden, the bones of it, the bare earth and the dormant roots and the evidence of things that would come back in spring, stronger for having spent the winter underground. I thought about the girl who had stood outside Harrington's with her face pressed to the glass. I thought, she would not recognize this life. Not because it is so large, though it is larger than she could have imagined, but because it is so entirely the life she built herself on her own terms, without asking permission or announcing what she was doing or needing anyone to see. I thought, she would be satisfied. I am satisfied. Undershire is where I am now. Daniel calls every Sunday the same as always. But the calls are different now, longer, fuller, genuinely curious in the way that conversations are when both people are paying attention. He asks about ChenMed. He asks about the properties. He asks about the transit corridor and the plans for Harrington's and the things George and I are working on. He asks because he wants to know, not because he has been prompted to ask. He asked me 2 Sundays ago if I would consider bringing him into the business in some capacity, not to take it over, not to inherit it as an object rather than a living thing, but to learn it. To understand it the way you understand something when you have worked in it rather than merely received it. I said, yes. Come on a Wednesday. I'll show you everything. He said, I'll be there. He was. Vivian came to Harrington's with me last month. Not as a customer this time as herself. I showed her the building. Paul Whitmore gave us a proper tour, the restoration work, the new display philosophy, the plans for the upper floors when the transit corridor comes through. He was professional and warm and treated us both with the same clear-eyed respect that had defined that first pivotal moment on the women's clothing floor. Vivian walked through the main atrium and looked up at the restored light fixtures and the marble floor and the high ceilings, and she was quiet for a long time. She said, "You've taken good care of it." I said, "I've always taken good care of things." She looked at me. There was something in her expression that had been growing slowly over the past several weeks, something that I thought was in its early form the beginning of genuine respect. Not the performed respect of a woman who has learned to manage her mother-in-law correctly, but the real thing. The kind that arrives when you have been forced to see someone accurately and what you see is worth respecting. She said, "I want to understand what you've built. Not for any other reason. I want to know." I said, "Then I'll tell you." And I did. Not all of it, there is a great deal and it takes time, but the beginning of it, standing in the atrium of the building I had bought because it was beautiful and because I had once pressed my face against its window, and the telling of it felt like something releasing, something that had been held for a long time finally being allowed to move. There is one more thing. About 2 weeks after the Saturday meeting, I received a text from Vivian. Not a call. A text, which was how she communicated most naturally. Short, efficient, warm in the particular way she was warm when she wasn't managing the warmth. Said, "I've been thinking about the dinner table. The corner. I'm sorry. You should have always been at the center." I read it once. Then I read it again. I wrote back, "Thank you. I accept." Then I put the phone in my pocket and I went back to my garden, which was still bare, still dormant, still working quietly underground at things that would not be visible for months. I thought, this is how it goes sometimes. Not in one dramatic moment. In accumulation. In the slow building of what is true until the truth is simply too large to remain invisible. I thought about the coat, hanging in my closet. I thought about Paul Whitmore on the floor of Harrington's, moving with the quiet certainty of a man making the right call. I thought about the girl with her face against the window, and the woman she had become, and the 63 years of work and patience and building and silence that connected one to the other. I thought, she would be satisfied. I thought, I am satisfied. I picked up the trowel and I went back to work. There is something I want to say before this ends. Not a lesson exactly. I distrust lessons that announce themselves too clearly. But something true, something that this particular life has taught me over a very long time. The world extends invisibility to women who seem modest and unassuming. I have said this already. But there is another side to it that I have been thinking about in the weeks since that Saturday meeting that feels important to name. The invisibility is only useful if you use it. There are women who are made invisible and stay that way, not by choice but by defeat. Who fold themselves smaller and smaller until the smallness becomes real, becomes who they are, becomes the only version of themselves they can imagine. I understand how that happens. I understand the gravity of it. There is a very natural pull, when the world has decided something about you, toward accepting that decision as true. I chose something different. I chose to let the world see what it wanted to see, and to use the privacy of that invisibility to build, carefully and without apology, exactly what I intended to build. I chose patience not as resignation but as strategy. I chose silence not as defeat but as preparation. And when the moment came, not manufactured, not forced, simply arrived, the way moments arrive when you have been ready for a long time, I did not announce myself. I did not make a speech. I stood in a department store I had owned for 3 years and I let the truth surface on its own, in its own time, through the ordinary professional courtesy of a man named Paul Whitmore who understood what he was seeing and made the right call. That is all it took. That is all it ever takes. Not drama. Not revenge. Not the settling of scores. Just the truth finally taking up the space it was always owed. I am 63 years old. I drive a 2009 Camry with a dent above the rear left wheel well. I wear cardigans. I keep a vegetable garden that is, I admit, rather rustic. I am also, as it turns out, somewhat more than that. I have always known what I was. I was simply waiting for the right moment to allow everyone else to know it too. The patience in the end was never the hard part. The hard part was trusting that the moment would come. It came. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated. And we tell those stories here.